Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Payal and you might also know me as the Simply Aesthetic from Instagram. A lot of you requested that I should make more tutorials using acrylics, so here we are today. And in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to paint this beautiful cherry blossom tree step by step. I've tried to make this tutorial as beginner friendly as possible, so you're going to be able to follow along even if you've never touched paints and brushes before. It's going to be a super therapeutic and a fun process, I promise you that. So without wasting any more time, let's gather our supplies and begin. Before we start painting, let me walk you through all the art supplies that I'll be using. So over here, I've got an 8 by 10 inch canvas board. Feel free to use whatever size that you want. Next, I've got acrylic paints of different brands. Let me walk you through the shades. So over here, I have cerulean blue and titanium white, which I'll be using for the background, that is the sky. Next, for the tree trunk and the branches, all the deeper details, I'll be using burnt umber and black. So whatever brown and black that you have with you works perfectly fine. For the cherry blossoms, you can either use permanent rose or a crimson color mixed with white to create different variations of pink. The idea is to have different pinks, so whatever red you have or pink you have works perfectly fine. And this is it. This is our limited color palette for today. Next, let's talk about the brushes. So for the background or the blend in the sky, I'll be using a 1 inch or a half an inch flat brush because it helps me cover a larger area at once and creates a very smooth blend. For all the other details, I'll be using round brushes of different kinds, honestly, some that come to a fine tip, some that don't. I also have a filbert brush here because it helps me create really soft clouds. You can see the different brush variations. Some are very fine tipped, some are a little bit blunt, and it works perfectly well. Next, I have a cloth to wipe down my brushes on and a jar of water to clean my brush and a mixing palette to mix my veins. And that is it. This is all that you need, so let's begin. I've taken blue and white on my palette and also my 1 inch flat brush, and we're going to work on the blend of the sky first. So I'm going to spray my canvas with some water using a spray bottle because this really helps with blending. It kind of helps the paints to move smoothly across the surface and prevent these harsh patchy strokes. So I've taken my flat brush as mentioned and I'm loading my brush with some blue paint directly and applying it at the top of my canvas. So as you can see, instead of getting very stiff straight strokes, we're getting a nice smooth blend already. And I also have this slight sway in my brush strokes. It's almost like a gentle wave and I'm not going left to right in a straight blend. And as I come towards the center of my canvas, I'm going to start adding a little bit of white into my blue, and I'm going to gently kind of blend them together, and you see how these colors are going to transition, right? So the top of my canvas is a little bit deeper blue. As I come towards the center of my canvas, it's a little bit more medium, it's getting lighter. And as I continue to move downwards, I'm going to start adding more white into the mix directly on my canvas. Now if you're not comfortable with this, you can always mix it separately on your mixing palette and then apply it on your canvas. But if you just want to go with your feelings and just enjoy the process, then you can do it right on your canvas itself. So as you can see, as I blended, the colors have gotten lighter, right? So you've got a really light shade of blue at the bottom, and you've got a medium shade of blue and a deeper shade of blue at the top. So right now you're just going to focus a lot on just blending the colors together so that you don't have any harsh lines, any harsh brush strokes, and they shouldn't look very artificial. We're trying to create a very soft blend in the sky, and that's why I said having a bigger sized flat brush helps, because you're going to cover a larger area all at once. You don't have to keep going back and forth multiple times in a smaller area. I've applied a little bit more blue at the top because it was a little bit streaky, and I'm going to come downwards. One thing that I noticed here was that my canvas was drying out very fast, so I've just sprayed it with some water to keep it a little bit wet and allow me some more time to blend the colors together. Acrylics is a very fast drying medium, so you have to be very quick with your blending process, otherwise you'll end up creating very streaky brush strokes. Now, if you prefer, you can obviously keep the sky just flat blue if you prefer, but in my opinion, creating this gradient kind of adds a very beautiful depth and visual interest right from the start, so you don't have to add more details later on. It's just going to look really visually interesting from the first try itself. I'm happy with the blend now, so I'm going to let this dry, and then we're going to come back and see if I need to layer over this again to bring in more opacity and bring it a little bit more softness. Alright, now that my surface has dried, you can see how the sky looks a little bit patchy, and that is completely normal, especially when you're working with acrylics or even gouache on a dry surface. So what we're going to do now is simply go back and add another layer. It's almost like repeating exactly what we did earlier. I'm starting with the blue at the top, and I'm going to slowly blend it downwards, adding white as I move towards the center and the bottom. Now think of this step as refining the base rather than doing anything new. So when you're painting backgrounds, especially skies, having a smooth and even surface is like really important, because this is the foundation of your painting, right? Everything else is going to sit on top of it. So if the background is patchy or uneven, it can distract from the overall look of your final piece. And layering obviously helps us build opacity and smooth out any of those uneven areas. And don't worry if your first layer didn't look perfect, because this is exactly why we're going to layer and make it look perfect now. So again, repeat the same brush movements, keep that gentle sway, blend the color softly, and make sure that there are no harsh lines. And take your time with this step. The smoother your background is, the more polished your final painting is going to look. Once you're done with it, you're going to let it dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, now that the background has completely dried, it's time for us to start adding the clouds. So for this, I'll be using my size 6 filbert brush. You can use a slightly smaller filbert brush if that's what you have. The rounded edges here actually helps you create these soft natural shapes, and I'm going to show you how. So for the clouds, imagine that they're sitting in the background, right? And we're going to add a lot of these details on top of it, so we don't have to actually overwork on them. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Next, we're not trying to paint very detailed, fluffy clouds here. Instead, we're trying to create soft, dispersed patches that gently sit somewhere in the sky. So I'm going to take a little bit of white paint on my brush, not too much, and I'm not trying to make it really thin. So I'm not adding white into my paint. I'm just letting it be nice and thick, and I'm going to go with this very light back and forth motion. It's almost like just grazing the surface with some paint. I'm not pressing hard, and that is because I want the texture of the canvas to break the paint slightly and give me those soft, uneven brush strokes. Now, one important thing here to notice is that the direction of your brush strokes, what they're going to be. Earlier, when we blended the sky, we added that slight sway in our brush movements, remember? So I'm going to follow that same direction when I'm adding the clouds. Now what this does is helps the clouds in the sky feel cohesive. If your sky has a certain flow and your clouds go in a completely different direction, it can look a little bit off. So we're trying to maintain that same gentle movement, almost like the clouds are flowing with the sky. Now, in terms of their shape, don't think of these as individual cloud outlines. Think of them as soft clusters. Some patches are slightly larger, some are broken into smaller pieces, and some areas are just left empty. And this variation is what creates that natural dispersion of the clouds. Also, since we're looking at the sky from below, the clouds are not going to appear very fluffy or rounded. They'll feel a little bit more stretched, slightly horizontal, and softly scattered across our working area. So avoid making them look too symmetrical or evenly spaced. Let some areas feel a little bit denser and some feel more open, and that imbalance actually is going to make the sky feel a little bit more realistic. So feel free to do what your heart says, add the clouds however you want. This can be a little bit tricky part, but the best thing is that you got a lot of details that are going to come in front of it. So even if you end up creating imperfect clouds or clouds that you're not really happy with, it works completely fine, because we are going to be almost covering it up, and only a few of these white patches that we are going to call clouds for this project is going to be visible. So this gives you a lot of freedom to just play around with it. Also, if this is the first time that you're creating this, it might not turn out perfectly, because there's a lot of brush movements and brush pressure control that plays a lot of important role when you're painting clouds. So don't try to overthink this step. Just think of this as adding clouds in your sky and just enjoying the process as it goes. And once you're happy with the clouds, you're going to let it dry before we start adding any further details to this. Now we're going to move on to sketching the branches, and for this step I'm going to be using a brown colored pencil. You can absolutely use a regular pencil here as well. So here I have the reference image on the right side and I'm using it as inspiration rather than copying it exactly. So over here you'll notice that on the right hand side we've got a main tree with slightly thicker trunks, and from there you've got smaller branches flowing outwards in different directions, and then you've got all these smaller branches just peeking through different sides of our painting. And over here what I'm majorly focusing on is the overall structure and the movement. So I'm going to start sketching the trunk and allowing the branches to extend outward from it, and at this stage I'm not focusing on the details, just kind of the placement and the direction in which they're flowing. Also make sure that you're not overcrowding the tree. Leave some breathing spaces in between the branches so that it doesn't feel too dense right from the beginning. So we can obviously build onto this as we go. And once you're done and happy with the placement of all your branches, you're going to move on to the next step, and that is painting them. So for the branches, I am creating a deep brown mix using black and brown together, and this gives us a rich, natural looking dark color instead of just a flat black shade. So over here I'll be using a round brush that comes to a really fine tip so that I can easily control both thicker and thinner strokes. So as I start painting these branches, I really want you to observe the natural flow of the tree. And this honestly is one of the most beautiful things about painting trees. They don't grow in straight, perfect lines. They twist, they curve, they branch out in slightly unpredictable ways, but everything still feels balanced. There is a kind of rhythm to them which I really like. So when you're painting trees and branches, don't think of them as straight lines. Think of them as movement. So over here I'm going to begin with the slightly thicker branch, applying slightly more pressure there. And when I do that, the stroke is thicker, right? And as I move outwards into the end of my branch, I'm going to gradually lift my brush. Now what this is going to do is create a natural taper where it's thicker at the base and thinner towards the end. So the extremely lightest amount of pressure that you can apply towards the end, you're going to do that to slightly touch your brush, the tip of your brush, and that is going to give you those thin lines. And if you apply more pressure, it's going to give you thicker lines. That's just the basic concept that we work on. This is something that really comes with practice. So the more you work on tapering your brushes, the better your branches are going to look. So the more pressure you apply, the thicker your brush stroke is going to be. As you release the pressure on your brush, that way it's going to taper into like a slightly medium brush stroke, and then it's going to get thinner, and then you'll have the thinnest brush stroke that is possible with your brushes. Now this tapering in your branches is what makes it feel very realistic. So as you extend your branches, let them move differently. You know, some can slightly curve towards the left, some towards the right, some can stretch outwards, some can split earlier than others, and some can, go on for longer and then split into two. And also vary the direction. Not everything needs to go straight up or straight left or right, whatever direction you're working in. So add a little bit of variation as you go. A slight tilt towards the left or right can make a very big difference. Also, when branches divide, try to avoid making them look very symmetrical. So one side can be slightly longer, the other can be slightly shorter, and that little imbalance is what makes the tree kind of feel alive. And don't try to fill every space. Leaving gaps between the branches is actually going to make the structure feel lighter and a little bit more natural, and give us enough room to add all our cherry blossoms in there. So I want you to really take your time here. Build the tree a little bit slowly and intentionally, almost like you're growing it branch by branch. So don't try to rush this process. Take your time with it and just kind of enjoy it. That's why I said it's going to be a therapeutic process, because a lot of these steps are repetitive, right? You can go on and on with the details in your trees and they can never end. So it's like you're taking your own sweet time with it and you're just going with the flow. I know that sometimes it can feel a little bit intimidating when you're painting a tree for the first time and you're like, bro, I don't know what's happening. I don't know which direction in which it's going to go. But really just think and visualize the trees that you've seen, or you can obviously go back to the reference image as well. I've also listed it down below in case you want to access it on your own and observe it on your own as well. So take your time, look at it, and just enjoy this process slowly. And once you're happy with it, you're going to let it dry completely, and then we're going to move on to the next step. To add a little bit more texture on my trees, what I'm going to do is mix a little bit of white into that same brown and black mix that I was using earlier. And using this thick paint, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of texture to my tree so that they don't look just flat with, just this dark shade everywhere. So I'm adding it on, let's say, the left side or the top portion of my trees of the main trunks or the branches that you're seeing. So you don't have to add them everywhere, just in this trunk that is on the right hand side, just to add a little bit of texture and character in there. This technique right here that we're doing to add the texture is called dry brush technique. Now what this does is that you have a really thick consistency of paint. So again, even here, don't add a lot of water into your paint mix, and what this will do is give you this thick paint, and when you rub it across like a cloth, you get rid of any extra pigment or paint that you might have, and just with the texture of the canvas and the texture or the thick texture of your paint, you are going to get these uneven strokes and a little bit of like broken texture on your tree basically. So this technique is something that we use a lot when we want to create textures in your trees, even sometimes in the grass, sometimes in the flower petals, where you don't want to overwork on each tiny detail, so you just work as texture, and that unevenness that you create works beautifully to create dimension in your painting. Now comes the fun part, painting the cherry blossoms. So since we're looking at this tree from a bit of a distance, we don't need to define every single petal. Instead, we're going to suggest the blossoms using color and texture. Let me show you. We'll be building the cherry blossoms in layers, starting off with the deepest shade. So for this, I've mixed crimson with white to create a rich, deeper pink tone. And I'm using a round brush that is a slightly more blunt edge at the top, so it's not really sharp. And what this will do is help me create softer, more natural marks rather than very sharp defined dots. So instead of painting individual flowers like I was mentioning earlier, I'm going to start tapping the brush onto the surface, and these taps are very light, controlled, and slightly irregular, and I want you to think of them as small clustered marks rather than perfect circles. So I'm going to begin by placing these taps along the outer edges of the branches where we created that skeleton structure earlier, remember? So that's where the blossoms are going to naturally sit. Now, you don't have to cover every single branch, and you don't have to make it fully like fluffy and everything. You have to actually leave some empty areas, and that will actually make the tree feel a little bit more airy and realistic. So right now I'm focusing on building the clusters rather than filling everything in. So like I said, some areas can be denser, and that's where I'll be tapping more of these dots together, and some of them are going to have scattered taps that will help the tree feel a little bit more airy. Now that variation is very important because it creates depth and prevents the tree from looking too flat. Also, in certain places, I'm going to lightly dip just the tip of my brush into a different variation of the same pink. Now what this will do is when I just dip the tip of my brush into crimson and then start tapping, it will kind of blend in as I tap, and you will get a slightly deeper pink along with the pink that we mixed earlier. Now what this does is helps introduce subtle color shifts even within this first layer. So instead of just one flat pink, you'll start seeing multiple tones within the deeper layer itself, and then obviously we'll layer lighter tones over it. Now this again makes the blossoms feel a little bit more natural and dimensional. One thing to keep in mind here is that you want to avoid placing the dots in a very uniform or patterned way. Let your hands kind of move naturally. Like I mentioned earlier, some taps can overlap, some can be spaced out, and that randomness is literally what makes this entire painting feel organic and the tree feel organic. And you can also play around with different pressure. A slightly lighter taps will create softer, smaller marks, while slightly firmer taps will create fuller impressions. So you're already getting variations just from your hand movement. And I want you to think of this step as slowly building clusters of blossoms rather than painting them all at once. And honestly, this process again is very repetitive, so just the same things are happening over and over again. So I want you to just kind of take it slow. You're like tapping your details, you're observing where you need to add more details and not add wherever you don't need to add more details. And it's just literally all about having fun in this step. There is no right or wrong. Your trees can't look wrong, right? And because these trees have so many different variations and details, you will end up creating the perfect tree. I'm sure. I have that much faith in you. So just take it slow, enjoy the process, and once you're happy with the first layer of the deeper pink blossoms, we're going to let it dry, and then we'll move on to adding layers over this. Alright, now that our base layer has dried completely, it's time for us to start adding highlights. And for this, I'm going to add a little bit of white into the same pink mixture and create a lighter but a medium tone. And we're going to actually repeat the same tapping technique here. Now, the reason why we are working in layers like this is because when you look at a cherry blossom tree from a distance, you never just see one flat shade of pink. Right? There are going to be multiple tones that are visible to you. Some areas that are going to be slightly darker, where the blossoms are denser or in shadow, and some areas catch more light and will appear lighter. So this second layer is going to help us build that variation and depth. And this is what is going to make that tree feel fuller and more dimensional. As I begin tapping, I'm placing the lighter pink on top of the previous layer, but I'm also being very intentional about it. And I also want you to notice how I'm holding my brush. I'm trying to tap with my brush kind of perpendicular to my surface, right? That is going to give a lot of pressure on the tip, and like this brush is a blunt edged brush, or it's not as sharp, it's going to create those softer strokes. Coming back to this, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that when you're making these taps, you want to make sure that you're not covering the entire base layer, and in fact, you want some of the deeper pink color to still show through. So I'm being very intentional about it, and I'm also leaving a little bit of gap in between these taps that I'm adding. And I want you to think of this like layering and not replacing. The darker color underneath should still peek through and create that natural depth within the tree. And I'm also focusing on the outer areas of the branches and building clusters. So some sections will get more of this lighter tone, especially where I want to suggest that the light is hitting the blossoms. And some of these areas I'm going to leave untouched so that they remain slightly deeper. And this sort of contrast between the darker base and the lighter layer is what is going to create that soft glowing effect in your cherry blossoms. Also, keep your taps irregular. Don't try to make them look uniform. Let them overlap slightly in some places and stay sparse in others. And that is going to, make your tree look very random and also very natural. And also, take your time with this step. You're going to start seeing how the tree is going to slowly build depth and begin to feel a little bit more alive with just this one additional layer. And once you're happy with the way the medium tone looks, you're going to let it dry, and then we'll move on to adding extra details in our trunk and branches and our final highlights. For this step, I'm switching back to my fine tip round brush, and the idea here is to refine the structure of the tree and bring back some of the branches that may have slightly gotten covered while we were adding the blossoms. So over here, I'm just going in with a deeper brown mix again, and I'm starting to add very fine, delicate branches. Now, if you notice, initially we only created the main skeleton of the tree, right? The trunk and the larger branches. But once we started tapping in the cherry blossoms, some of those branches naturally got softened or partially became hidden. So at this stage, I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm going to be creating these finer branches, but I'm also redefining the shape of the existing branches that may have been covered with the cherry blossoms. This helps bring back clarity to the structure and redefine the shape a little bit more. So instead of the tree feeling like just a mass of pink, you just start seeing that underlying framework of the trees again. To do this, I'm lightly dragging my brush to create very thin, delicate strokes that extend outwards from the existing branches. And then there are these smaller supporting branches that naturally hold the blossoms along with the main structure. And this is done because we're looking at the tree from below. So when we're actually looking up from down below, you're going to be seeing the trunks, all those finer details on the main branches and the sub branches, along with the cherry blossoms. So basically, when you're adding these details in, you're going to help reinforce that perspective and make the tree feel a little bit more realistic. Over here, if you notice that I'm using very light pressure, just small flicks and gentle pulls so that the strokes kind of taper in naturally. And this step is all about balance. I don't want to overdo this, but I just want to do enough so that the structure kind of shows through the blossoms. So I'm being very selective when I'm adding these strokes, okay? So I'm adding them only where I feel the branches need to be redefined again and need a little bit more details. In some of the areas, I'm also going to switch to a slightly lighter brown shade. So I've just added a little bit more white into the same mix. And I'm doing this because I want to add a bit more variation within the branches itself and not make my entire painting look very flat. So if I were to use just a single shade, it would look very flat. That's why I'm trying to bring in a little bit variation with playing with the colors that I have. So like the color that I've used for all the other branches is a deeper shade of brown. So over here I'm just bringing in more variations by also playing around with the color of browns that I'm using. So I'm playing around with a lighter shade of brown, a deeper shade of brown, and that naturally just adds a very realistic feel into your trees. So even over here, I'm using very delicate brush strokes to bring out more details into the finer branches. And as you can see, I'm really playing around with the different brush strokes and the directions of my branches, everything that I've actually told you earlier. So again, this process is very repetitive and really just follow what your heart says. Wherever your heart desires for you to add a branch, go ahead and do that. Like I've mentioned earlier, trees are very organic forms and they don't really have any patterns in there and they just go with the flow. That's how I feel about trees, and I like to always put them in my paintings as well. Just add a very free flowing, no structure kind of feel into my paintings. And anytime someone tells me like, okay, how do you paint this tree, like explain it to me, I always tell them like, okay, XYZ, there is definitely a way in which you make those, but obviously just play around with the structure and just really do what your heart desires in those situations. Once I'm happy with how the structure is coming along, I'm going to start adding a little bit more texture and light into these trunks. So like I was mentioning earlier, we're looking up at this tree from down below, right? And the thicker trunk, especially the one on the right hand side that we've made, will catch more light. So naturally I would want to create more variations and details in there so that it prevents the trunk from looking too flat. And how do you do that? You do that by adding a bit more light and texture on there. So I'm going to take a lighter brown color and I'm going to use the dry brush technique that I was mentioning earlier. And you're going to use that technique and create textures on your trunk. So gently load up your brush with some paint and gently drag the brush across the surface so that it catches only in certain areas, and that is going to create the soft textured effect. This kind of gives the impression of the light hitting the trunk and bringing out its texture and its form. So right now I'm only focusing mainly on the thicker trunk where the texture would naturally be more visible. Along with that, obviously you've got those thicker branches, so I'm adding texture on that as well. And once I'm actually happy with the final refinements, we are ready for the final step, and that is adding highlights. For adding the highlights, I've switched to my round brush that comes to a really fine tip, and I'm using a mix of a very light pink color, and that is done by adding more white into the crimson mix. Now this is the lightest value in our painting, and this is what is really going to bring that soft glow into the tree. Now I'm going to go back with the same tapping technique that we've used so far, but this time I'm going to be a bit more intentional with my placement. I'm not tapping everywhere, I'm only adding these highlights in selective areas. And think of this step as placing the light. Where would the light naturally hit the blossoms the most? Usually it's along the outer edges of the clusters and on the areas that feel a bit more exposed. So that's exactly where I'm going to be focusing these lighter taps on. I'm also keeping my hand very light here. These taps are softer and a little bit more controlled compared to our previous layers. In some places I'm barely touching the surface, so the mark stays very delicate. And now one very important thing here is to not overdo this step. It can be very tempting to add more and more of the light pink color because it looks so pretty, but if we cover too much, we'll lose all the depth we've created so far. Those deeper and the mid-tones that we have given earlier is what gives the tree or the cherry blossoms their volume. So if we want them to still be visible, we have to be very intentional with the highlights that we add on top. Also, try to keep the placement slightly uneven. Let some areas have more highlights and some areas have very little. That variation is going to help create a natural glowing effect in your tree and your overall composition. And you'll also notice that with just a few lighter touches, the entire tree starts to feel brighter and more dimensional. And that is the power of adding highlights. At this stage, I also like to take a step back and observe the painting as a whole. If I feel like there are any areas that need a little bit more balance, maybe a few extra blossoms here or a slight adjustment in the branches, I go ahead, add that and fix it. And this is basically like your final chance to redefine the composition. And once you're happy with it, you're going to let everything dry and your painting is complete. Here it is. This is your final painting. I hope in this tutorial you were able to understand how to build soft background, create natural looking branches and layer your cherry blossoms step by step to bring in depth and variations. More than anything, I hope this helped you see how simple brush movements and layering can come together to create something so delicate and beautiful. And that is it, you guys. I hope you enjoyed the painting process. If you've painted along, don't forget to share your work via DMs or tagging me on Instagram at The Simply Aesthetic, because I truly do enjoy seeing a recreation. If you have any suggestions on the topics, mediums or subjects that you'd like me to cover, you can drop them down below along with some sweet comments if you really enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel for more such art tutorials, because I'm trying to be more consistent and bring out painting tutorials for you guys every other weekend. And that is it from me from this tutorial. I will see you in the next one. Bye!